When studying the Lee family of Virginia, it's hard not to be mesmerized by Stratford Hall, that baronial seat of one branch of the Lee family, and of course the sons that Stratford produced. The mind readily fixes upon that grand Westmoreland seat, which ushered into the world two signers of the Declaration of Independence, two revolutionary diplomats, and the senior statesmen of the early republic. And so, for generations, Stratford has stood as the visible symbol of the Lee dynasty and what it produced. Yet the Lees of Stratford Hall were not the only line of Lees of public note and renown. In fact, it was the other line of Lees, sired along the upper waters of the Potomac, that is more famous, as it produced Light Horse Harry Lee and Robert E. Lee. This line produced a legendary Revolutionary War cavalry commander who became the intimate favorite of George Washington, the general-in-chief of the Confederate States Army, whose military strategies astounded European observers, three additional major generals who led division-scale operations across the battlefields of the 19th century, a United States Attorney General who served in the cabinets of two presidents, and a federal congressman whose behind-the-scenes vote permanently fixed the site of our nation's capital on the banks of the Potomac while ensuring the assumption of state debts. It also produced a crusading mayor of Alexandria, a distinguished naval commander who navigated the steam flagship that opened the closed empire of Japan to the Western world, and a late 19th century governor who possessed the singular distinction of commanding regular troops under both the Confederate and postbellum United States flags. This unmatched array of public, legal, and martial achievement belonged not to Lees of Stratford Hall, but to the Lees of Virginia. While the masters of Stratford operated with a haughty, sometimes overbearing patrician grandeur, their kinsmen on the high bluffs of Prince William County cultivated a quieter, more intense, and deeply duty-bound style of command. The Leesylvania Lees were a branch that entered the world under the shadow of a younger son's pittance of an inheritance, yet managed across three successive generations to produce some of the greatest men of our history. Such is what we will discuss in this episode. The Lees of Leesylvania, and the great men of that line. This will be an overview episode covering all the notable men of the line. Some, like Henry Lee I, Henry Lee II, Smith Lee, Richard Bland Lee, and Charles Lee, the Attorney General, not the soldier, who was unrelated to them, are quite notable, but there's not really enough information on them to do a full episode for each man, and in addition, that would take a very long time. So I figured that this overview episode would be a good way of covering what matters about their lives without unduly weighing down the show with short episodes on each individual, and to connect the general history of this branch of the family to its greatest achievements and American history. So, the history of the Lees of Leesylvania goes back to the division of the family fortune that occurred amongst the grandchildren of Colonel Richard Lee I, the emigrant who we covered in the first episode of this series. When the family capital was divided under the general strictures of primogeniture upon the death of Richard Lee II, whose life we've also covered, the family was split into two geographic camps. There was the Stratford line, which was sired by the dynamic and aggressively acquisitive Thomas Lee, who himself inherited little. And then there was the Leesylvania line, which was established by his younger brother, Henry Lee I. The two were actually close friends, and their elder brother remained in England and passed away, leaving his property to them. So we're going to be focusing on Henry Lee I, as he's the one who founded the Leesylvania line. Born in the late decades of the 17th century, Henry Lee I was the third surviving son of Richard Lee II, the scholar, whose fascinating life we covered in a past episode, and Letitia Corbin of Mackinac Plantation. Within the quiet, book-lined chambers of the family seat his father inherited, Henry I was pulled by two impulses. On one hand, he grew to maturity in an environment dominated by his father's immense classical learning and general unwillingness to accumulate more land rather than just steward what he had. But on the other hand, Henry was certainly shaped by his brother Thomas and Thomas's fierce, insatiable drive for land accumulation. And so Henry has been generally overshadowed in history by these two formidable personalities and generally dismissed as a quiet, conservative, provincial figure who was content to simply maintain his inherited holding, much as his father did, while his contemporaries grew fabulously rich by aggressively patenting the western wilderness. So that's to say, he is thought by many to be much like his father, Richard Lee II, just on a smaller scale. Not particularly notable, an inheritor rather than a builder, a man who gave up a chance at a great fortune for the family by merely holding what he inherited from family members, namely his elder brother, Richard Lee III, and his father, Richard Lee II, rather than accumulating land on his own. It's Burton Hendrick in his book, The Lees of Virginia, that summarizes such a view, speaking particularly of the first few generations of the Leesylvania Lees, actually, saying, quote, "The Leesylvania Lees were worthy, substantial, placid, high-minded citizens without a touch of the genius that was domiciled at Stratford," end quote. But that's an incorrect impression, actually. Henry Lee I was a major tobacco planter, one of the first order, overseeing extensive operations along the Westmoreland creeks and mastering the complex financial talents it took to be a master of the transatlantic consignment trade. Moreover, he was a man who possessed a natural aptitude for the rugged responsibilities of frontier defense. As lieutenant colonel with the Westmoreland militia, Henry I spent decades training provincial companies, maintaining the county's arsenals, and holding the defensive line of the Northern Neck against persistent threats from frontier raiders and maritime privateers. Pirates, that is to say. This was the day of Blackbeard, after all, and such raiders particularly enjoyed plundering the riverfront estates of the Virginia gentry. Perhaps we'll cover that in the future. Henry Lee I, in being a planter and a fighter, formed a genetic link between the scholarly reclusiveness of Richard II on one hand and the intense martial spirit that would characterize his own grandsons and their descendants. I think author Richard Gamble describes Henry I in his book Sully. He does a particularly good job of describing Henry I, that is to say. So in this book, Gamble says, quote, "For the most part, Thomas Lee's brother Henry was content to concentrate his holdings in the lower portion of the Northern Neck, near his own home at Lee Hall in Westmoreland County. The single exception to this pattern was the tract at Freestone Point, 80 miles upstream in what was then Stafford, later Prince William, County, a broad peninsula rising boldly from the water's edge between the mouths of Powell and Yapsco Creeks. Freestone Point jutted into the placid river at a place where the Potomac stretched almost 3 miles across to the low Maryland shore. The tract had been devised to Lee by the oldest of his brothers, the third Richard Lee, who himself preferred the bustling life of mercantile London to that of a Northern Neck plantation. In 1717, Henry Lee secured from the Fairfax family a new patent on this land. Not, however, until 1725, 3 years after the Iroquois had agreed by the terms of the Treaty of Albany to remain west of the Blue Ridge, did Henry Lee follow his brother's suit and move to gain a foothold in the rich Piedmont uplands above the falls. He was not an adventurer, and in this act he moved abreast rather than ahead of several other enterprising Westmoreland County planters in what appears to have been a mild land rush into the valleys of Cub and Bull Runs. The movement was doubtless impelled by the diminishing fertility of tidewater soil, as well as by the planters' natural ambition for themselves and their offspring. Each man, in his own way, was something of a dynast. Each was the lord of his own isolated barony along the great river, a good 3 days' journey by water from the colonial capital at Williamsburg. If Thomas Lee displayed exceptional acumen and zeal, his brother and other Potomac planters, by the very circumstances of their existence, harbored much of the same aspirations in this seemingly limitless land that stretched ever westward, beyond the farthest known mountain range or navigable stream, until even the liveliest imaginations were exhausted in trying to divine where it might end or what marvels it might yet conceal." End quote. That's not all. Gamble also notes that Henry Lee I, even if his aspirations were somewhat less than his brother, did accumulate and clear frontier lands for planting. It was to be this land, actually, that became the famous Leesylvania. So he wasn't just inheriting, he wasn't just holding, he wasn't just stewarding. He was expanding the family's domain, and it was quite of benefit to them in the future that he did so. So describing the origins of this property's use by the family, Gamble says, again in the book Sully, The Biography of a House, which is quite good, quote, Henry Lee's primary interest, however, remained firmly fixed upon his tidewater plantations. For 5 years, for a decade or more, the Cub Run tract may have lain undisturbed, or if used by Lee at all, serving only as a rangeland. This alone is certain, that sometime before 1746, Henry Lee established a quarter at his remote upland holding. That is to say, he settled a group of slave laborers there who, under the vision of an overseer, began to clear the land and prepare it for cultivation. The establishment of such quarters at distant holdings was a common practice among the larger planters and along the frontier of the proprietary. Between the Potomac and the eastern slopes of the Blue Ridge, these quarters soon became the vanguard of the expanding plantation economy. End quote. Continuing, Gamble notes, further putting this property in the context of the Leesylvania Lee family's history and Henry Lee I's life, quote, entrusting more distant holdings to his overseers, Henry Lee and his wife, Mary Bland, continued to reside comfortably at Lee Hall, a few miles downriver from Stratford Hall, the splendid home his brother had built above the sandy Potomac cliffs where eagles still nested. Life revolved around the yearly cycle of planting and harvesting and the multiple responsibilities of administering several scattered properties as a whole, while maintaining each as a relatively self-sustaining unit. By boat and by horseback, Lee presumably made periodic trips of inspection to his 2 farthest holdings, traveling by river to Freestone Point, thence overland to the waters of Cub Run. Riding through the backcountry above the Potomac Falls, he probably observed with approval the steady, confident advance of settlement and the wisps of smoke that arose from piles of smoldering brush in the woodland clearings as the ancient forests fell before the blades, wielded by gangs of slave workmen belonging to the gentry, or by small, independent freeholders struggling to wrest sustenance and security from the freshly turned soil. Henry Lee lived to see this region and his Cub Run lands become, in 1742, part of the new county of Fairfax, its name honoring the proprietary family, and, during the closing years of his life, he optimistically augmented the tract through the acquisition of some 300 adjoining acres. The master of Lee Hall was in his 55th year, still alert but sensing the approaching end, when he made his will on July 30th, 1746. Of his 73 slaves, 9 were then living at Freestone Point. There was an equal number at the quarter on Cub Run, and in his will he listed them by name: Titus, Cain, Westminster, Eve, Harry, Joe, Sabina, her child Joe, and Henry's 6 men, 2 women, and a little boy. The following summer, having lived to a respectable, if not patriarchal age, the vestryman of Coppell Parish, and an esteemed squire of Westmoreland County, Henry Lee died and was buried in the family ground at Lee Hall. End quote. Noting the similarities between him and his beloved brother Thomas, whose life we covered in a past episode, Paul Nagel notes in The Lees of Virginia, quote, these young sons had lived with their father in his last days. The 2 were much more than brothers. They would always remain friends and associates in a partnership that powerfully shaped the Lee family's commanding role in Virginia and American history. From them descended the famous Lees of Stratford and Leesylvania. End quote. So upon his death in the summer of 1747, passing away as a man known as an esteemed squire, Henry Lee I executed a somewhat unusual will for the period, one that redirected his family's trajectory, mostly bypassing his eldest son, John Lee, who had established himself as a happy, non-confrontational bachelor clerk in Westmoreland. Henry I bequeathed his primary residential seat, Lee Hall, to his middle son, Richard Lee, who would spend the next 40 years ruling his local neighborhood as a legendary squire of the county. But it was to his youngest son, Henry Lee II, that the patriarch left a collection of mostly uncultivated, scattered wilderness holdings situated far up the Potomac River in the land we were just talking about. Cobb Hall, the future land of Leesylvania in the newly organized territory of Prince William County. It was a meager patrimony for a younger son, a tract of heavy timber and rugged stone completely removed from the elegant social circles of the lower rivers. So, describing the division of the property that went on at this generation, Gamble notes, quote, "In accordance with the provisions of his will, the plantations on the lower river, including the home estate, were conveyed to his two eldest sons, John and Richard. Henry Lee II, the youngest son, was then but a youth of 18, a student at the College of William and Mary. In the England of his forebears, he would almost certainly have been left landless, but here in bountiful Virginia, he was amply provided for. To him was bequeathed all the land and plantations thereon at Freestone Point and at Salisbury Plain, together with the slaves at each holding and 2 other servants from the household at Lee Hall. In addition, he received all stocks of cattle and hogs then on the 2 estates. But he was 3 years away from legal adulthood, and until that time, his father's will commended the care of his affairs and those of his sister Letitia to the guardianship of their uncles, Thomas Lee of Stratford and Colonel William Beverley of Blandfield. The will directed that young Henry be continued at the college 2 years and then serve as a writer or clerk in the office of the secretary of the colony in order to acquire experience in affairs of state." End quote. Henry Lee II, however, possessed the enterprise, broad vision, and illimitable ambition that had characterized his uncle, Thomas Lee of Stratford. Recognizing that he needed both social prestige and much more income-producing land before he could support a major plantation establishment, the young Virginian turned his attention toward the great marriage market of the provincial aristocracy. In the spring of 1753, Henry II executed a triumphant marital alliance. The Lees were always good at these. That was the talk of the Tidewater gentry. He won the hand of Lucy Grimes, the celebrated lowland beauty of her day. Lucy was a daughter of the wealthy Charles Grimes of Richmond County, and her extraordinary physical beauty, famous charm, and vibrant intelligence had previously captured and famously rejected the youthful, lovesick verses of a young, uniformed surveyor named George Washington. So yes, he beat out George Washington in the fight over the hand of a beautiful woman. This marital alliance was to prove most advantageous. Equipped with Lucy's substantial dowry and his own accumulated credit as a man of some commercial merit, Henry Lee II decided to commence the clearing of his Prince William County forests. In the late months of 1753, he completed construction of a new family manor house, giving the sprawling estate the name Leesylvania, the Woods of Lee. The site chosen for the mansion house was a spectacular, high, and heavily forested peninsula that projected boldly into the tidal waters of the Potomac River, known to the local mariners as Freestone Point. So yes, it's this land that he inherited. Erected upon the crest of the high bluff, the residence he built commanded a stunning panoramic view of the river horizon, somewhat like Chantilly on the Potomac of Richard Henry Lee in this regard, and it looked down upon the broad shipping lanes that carried Virginia tobacco to the ports of Europe. The house was designed as a substantial 2.5-story rectangular block with clean gabled roof lines, constructed of brick, and locally quarried stone. Set back a bit from the river's edge to escape any marsh fevers of the sort that had long devastated shore dwellers like those at Jamestown early on. Can't be getting malaria. Leesylvania was a statement of permanence, of setting down new territorial roots in this wooded, dense, primordial forest, showing that this younger line of Lees would be independent from the older family capitals at Westmoreland. So describing this in the social cachet that Henry Lee II built alongside his newfound estate and fortune, Gamble writes, quote, "For their home, the couple chose the peninsula tract that Henry had inherited at Freestone Point, where the rising wooded hills afforded a lordly view of the embracing Potomac. It was a spot of serene loveliness, one that easily suggested the name soon given it by the bridal pair, Leesylvania." End quote. Under the administration of Henry Lee II, Leesylvania rapidly evolved into a flawless model of the self-contained, self-sustaining Virginia plantation principality. Below the gabled manor house, the fertile soils of the peninsula were partitioned into distinct operational quarters where hundreds of enslaved workers cleared fields, cleared the ancient oak roots, and cultivated massive crops of corn, wheat, and high-quality, sweet-scented tobacco. Henry II was a meticulous agricultural innovator, introducing scientific crop rotation models and establishing large-scale domestic manufacturing operations within his own plantation yards. He was much like George Washington in this regard. Though he had beaten Washington out in the fight for the hand of the lowland beauty, he was a very competent planter, and his attention to detail, much like Washington's, helped him build a modest fortune into a great one and remain free of the trappings of many of the Virginia gentlemen of this period, particularly debt. So the real wealth of Leesylvania wasn't just in the soil, it was in the water lanes that washed against the shores of Freestone Point. Henry II saw that the great annual runs of American shad and herring along the Potomac Flats were something that could be highly profitable as a maritime resource, and so he established extensive commercial fisheries along the beaches beneath his cliffs. And during the spring spawning season, massive seine nets, frequently hundreds of yards in length, were rowed out into the river by boatmen and hauled back to the shore by horse teams, pulling in unimaginable quantities of fish just in a single day's operations. And so the plantation, when this was happening, became bustling as a maritime factory. Gangs of workers cleaned, salted, and packed the catch into tight wooden barrels, which were, of course, manufactured by the estate's own coopers using trees on the estate. And this created a vast supply of high-protein provisions that could feed Henry Lee II's own laborers, or be sent as a lucrative export to the sugar islands in the West Indies, which were always in need of food imported from America. And there was more that went on as well, describing the plantation operations at this period, particularly the famous hams produced at the place. In his book Sully, Gamble notes, quote, "No doubt one of the commodities produced at the quarter was pork. For Virginia hams were second only to tobacco in export value, and nothing was simpler than to let the semi-domestic hogs of the period ramble through the summer woods, rooting among the vines for acorns and wild berries. The succulent flavor of Virginia hams was even attributed to the fact that the hogs were allowed to range. As to the crops cultivated besides tobacco, Henry Lee himself provides one brief mention in a 1763 letter. Addressing his brother Richard at Lee Hall, he casually remarked that he then had 630 barrels of corn at Leesylvania, besides about 100 barrels in Loudoun, meaning Loudoun County, to spare. Wheat was probably raised at the quarter by the 1760s. Converted to flour at one of the primitive mills being built along Cub Run, wheat was more easily transportable than tobacco and found a ready market. Besides, in the face of the persistent efforts of the Tidewater-bred landholders, it was becoming plainly evident that most of the upland soils were ill-suited for the staple crop of Lower Virginia. So much so that, in 1759, the General Assembly authorized Loudoun County to pay its levies and officers' fees in specie, meaning coin, rather than the usual medium of tobacco. It was reported that the inhabitants make but little tobacco, and many of them none." End quote. So, parallel to this robust collection of crops, maritime commerce, and hams, was a deep and consuming passion for the turf that would become one of the defining hallmarks of the Leesylvania line. They loved horses. Henry II was obsessed with fine thoroughbred racehorses, viewing them not as luxury items, but in the way that gentlemen have always viewed such beasts, and something that the Virginia gentry generally viewed them as: a living manifestation of honor, beauty, and heritage, aristocratic heritage in particular. The grand stables at Leesylvania were legendary throughout the colony, housing an elite collection, really, of blooded stock that was imported directly from the racing stables of Great Britain. So he used his wealth to embark upon this as well, and spent vast sums breeding and training his horses, and his private notebooks are filled with meticulous trackings of lineages, boasting names like Diamond, Roan, Gimrack, Ratner, Flimack, and his celebrated bay mare, Famous. Inappropriate name. It was within these very paddocks that the next generation of Leesylvania squires developed that flawless, near instinctive equestrianism that would astound observers on later battlefields. Light Horse Harry grew up in the saddle, learning with his father's horses how to manage the most volatile horses with a calm, effortless self-command that mirrored his father's style of discipline, of the Virginia habit of command. So, describing Henry Lee II over this time period, Gamble notes, quote, "But Colonel Henry Lee II let neither his expansive hospitality nor his continuous round of official duties cause him to neglect his private affairs. Above all else, he was a planter, and year after year he applied himself vigorously to his farming activities on the Potomac and at the Salisbury Plain quarter on Cub Run. Each fall, from the wharf at Leesylvania, he dispatched quantities of sweet-scented and Orinoco to the tobacco markets in London. He was a businessman as well as a public official and sportsman, but also a faithful churchman who at times sprinkled his letter with wisdom from the holy psalmist. A surviving portrait depicts Henry Lee II in the prime of life, a handsome, full-cheeked man with a delicate, almost sensuous mouth and flowing powdered hair. Modishly attired in waistcoat and ruffled stock, he gazes from the world of mid-18th century Virginia in self-assurance, confident of the overarching order of heaven and earth and of his place in the scheme of things." End quote. So yes, he was very much the Virginia patrician, the gentleman, a member of this flowering gentry order, really at its height in the golden age of Virginia. Gamble also notes that Henry got into politics and county leadership in the best tradition of the Virginia gentry, a tradition we, of course, covered in a recent episode, and was encouraged in this by the governor, actually. Quote, "Because of his position and training, Henry Lee fell readily into the role of country gentleman and local leader. Within a few years, he dominated the ruling hierarchy of Prince William County as presiding justice of the county court and commander of the county militia, both posts of considerable prestige and power, filled by direct appointment from the royal governor. At a time when no less than 4 other Lees sat in the councils of government at Williamsburg, Henry Lee was also elected as one of the burgesses from Prince William County." End quote. However earnest and generally capable he might have been, this Henry Lee was not the great man of history his descendants were to become, or that his cousins of Stratford Hall were. Burton Hendrick in the Lees of Virginia contrasts Henry Lee II of Leesylvania with the Lees of Stratford Hall, noting, quote, "The second Henry, indeed, served as burgess contemporaneously with Richard Henry Lee and Francis Lightfoot, being one of the 7 Lees who adorned Williamsburg in that time. He, too, displayed a genuine patriotism in the days of the Stamp Acts, and was as earnest in the colonial cause as the Stratford scions themselves. But no important act of statesmanship stands to his credit." End quote. But while he might not have been as politically influential as his cousins in his role as a burgess, he used hospitality to aid the revolutionary cause, both before and during the War for American Independence. The isolated high bluff of Leesylvania was as high up the Potomac as one could go before reaching the falls, but it was far from a lonely frontier outpost or even a mere commercial entrepot. It stood as a primary social and political capital for the upper Potomac gentry, which was very useful during the Revolution. Positioned adjacent to the highway, the primary overland post road connecting the northern colonies with Williamsburg, the mansion house at Leesylvania became a stopping point for a continuous stream of traveling statesmen, kinsmen, and dignitaries. Henry Lee II and Lucy Grimes were lavish and open-handed in their hospitality and were celebrated for the environment of intellectual warmth and convivial ease that they built at Leesylvania. Particularly important was that amongst the most frequent and welcome guests at the Leesylvania hearth was George Washington of Mount Vernon. Bypassing any residual awkwardness that might have come from his youthful courtship of the lowland beauty, Washington maintained an intimate and lifelong personal and business friendship with Henry Lee II. His diaries record dozens of visits to the house at Freestone Point, where he routinely dined, slept, and engaged in deep, unhurried conversations regarding everything from land speculation and agricultural improvements, which interested them both, to the growing constitutional resistance to parliamentary taxation. And so it was around this very table, in an atmosphere warmed by fine wine and classical learning, for which the Virginia gentry is famous, that the next generation of Leesylvania children grew to maturity, absorbing the principles of liberty and listening to the first radical cries for American independence from those who gathered around their father's table. So describing this, author Ryan Cole, in his book Light Horse Harry Lee, notes, quote, "Life at Leesylvania provided the perfect milieu for the upbringing of the young Virginia aristocrats. The estate's acreage provided a venue for young Lee to roam on horseback and to raise ponies. The wild fields and thick forests were the perfect venue for practicing marksmanship and fencing. Tutors provided the foundation of an education. Then there was the river, whose waters had been a constant in the life of the Lee family since their arrival in America. The Potomac was the boys' primary vista, and the river, along with the King's Road, just miles away and linking the 13 colonies, brought a regular line of guests to Leesylvania. End quote. And so, as the imperial crisis erupted into open revolutionary warfare in the mid-1770s, the household at Leesylvania ushered onto the national stage a collection of sons whose collective capabilities rapidly rivaled the legendary band of brothers from Stratford Hall, whose lives we covered collectively in a past episode. Henry Lee II and Lucy Grimes produced a family of extraordinary intellectual and practical talents, a generation of young men who seemed perfectly molded to make early American dreams of national liberty and greatness a reality through their victories, through their work in the law, through their work in politics. They did a great deal. The generation of Lees that followed Henry Lee II was to be of incredible importance in American history. Describing this revolutionary generation of Lees of both Stratford Hall and Leesylvania, great men all, Paul Nagel notes in the Lees of Virginia, quote, "Deaths of Thomas and Henry Lee, masters of Stratford and Lee Hall, opened a new era in the family's story. Thanks to another generation, the Lees world would soon extend beyond Potomac Plantation Society and Williamsburg politics, reaching to faraway places like Philadelphia, Edinburgh, London, Paris, and even Berlin." End quote. On the Leesylvania side, it was with the Revolution that the renown of the Lees of Leesylvania became great. As Hendrick notes, describing the ascendance of this third generation around the period of the Revolution, quote, "The Lees of Lee Hall and Leesylvania now for the first time emerge as powerful figures in their nation's history." He adds, "For the first two generations, these Henrys had been a rather prosaic lot, prosperous country squires, not marked for leadership in the state, quite cast in shadow by the brilliance of their Stratford cousins. Lee Hall in Westmoreland and its successor, Leesylvania and Prince William, were gathering places of hospitality, but never attained the eminence that Stratford held in Virginian eyes." End quote. That was all to change with this magnificent Henry Lee III and his brothers. And so, as Connolly puts it in the book The Marble Man, quote, "By the end of the Revolution, the Lees of Leesylvania, already affluent in land and commerce, were active in political affairs. Lucy Grimes Lee, legendary sweetheart of George Washington, had borne Charles Lee, Attorney General for the first president, and Richard Bland Lee, the famous Virginia Federalist leader." End quote. The eldest of these remarkable siblings was Henry Lee III, ushered into the world during the bitter winter of January 1756. Born to the saddle and educated at Princeton under the strict tutelage of John Witherspoon, the young scholar, cavalryman, was destined for a spectacular, meteoric military glory during the Revolutionary War. Commissioned at the age of 20 by Patrick Henry, he assumed command of an independent partisan legion, mastering the complex and dangerous arts of light cavalry reconnaissance, deep penetration raids, and frontier logistics, at which he was actually quite adept, despite his later failures as a speculator. His extraordinary brilliance, his daring, his flawless tactical sense was shown through battles like Paulus Hook and across the Carolinas during the Southern campaign, and this earned him the immortal title of Light Horse Harry and made him the personal favorite of General George Washington. We'll cover this cavalier of the Revolution and failed speculator, the father of Robert E. Lee, more in the future. Following Harry in the lineup was Charles Lee, born in 1758. Charles was always characterized by profound intelligence and very deep seriousness, somewhat less of the cavalier than his elder brother. He, like his brothers, pursued a rigorous course of studies at Princeton and then focused on the law within law offices in Philadelphia and developed really an unmatched mastery of jurisprudence, maritime law, constitutional law. Unlike his dashing older brother, Charles detested the theatrics of public life and so operated instead as a quiet but formidable force behind the scenes in the early American Republic. And his legal brilliance during this period caught the attention of the chief executive. In 1795, President George Washington appointed the 37-year-old Virginian to serve as the Attorney General of the United States. a post he maintained with distinction throughout the turbulent administration of John Adams. And through this position, he became a primary architect of federal legal policy, defending the independent authority of the judiciary and helping stabilize the nation's constitutional design. He was also involved in arguing very famous cases from the period, such as Marbury versus Madison. The third son, Richard Bland Lee, born in 1761, possessed a sophisticated, far-reaching grasp of political economy and federal finance. Elected to represent his native county within the first United States Congress, Richard Bland became one of the leading Federalist voices within the legislative chambers, and this was actually something that distinguished the Leesylvania Lees generally, but led by Richard Bland, from the Stratford Hall Lees. The Stratford Lees were anti-federalists. The Leesylvania Lees were federalists. It's one of those weird things. There's the split within the family. In any case, it was during the high-stakes years right after the Constitution was adopted, particularly the crisis of 1790, that this young Virginian executed one of the most important domestic diplomatic, maneuvers in our early republic's history, with the nation facing huge problems, maybe even dissolution, over Alexander Hamilton's financial plan for the federal assumption of state war debts, a measure fiercely opposed by the planter interest in Virginia because Virginia had taxed its planters heavily to pay its debts, unlike the northern states. Richard Bland Lee negotiated what's now a legendary behind-the-scenes compromise between Hamilton and Jefferson, in exchange for casting his own critical deciding vote in favor of debt assumption. Richard Bland extracted a guarantee that the national capital would be located in the South, anchoring the District of Columbia upon the shores of his beloved Potomac River. Unfortunately, Richard Bland Lee's life was marked by catastrophe brought about by his beloved brother, Light Horse Harry. Harry's speculation-induced debt woes became a problem for Richard Bland, who lost his beloved plantation of Sully, which was quite a prosperous place before Light Horse Harry destroyed it, due to these debts, and that made Richard Bland have a much harder time of it with his career afterwards, and he somewhat fades from history. So we'll cover him some more in future episodes in Light Horse Harry, but he was a remarkable Federalist politician. The youngest of the major siblings, Edmund Jennings Lee, born in 1772, directed his intellectual energies into the sphere of municipal reform and religious stewardship. He decided to reside within the bustling river port of Alexandria, Virginia, and while he did so, he became known as a prominent crusading lawyer who was eventually elected to be the mayor of the city. He was a man of deep, unyielding Anglican piety, and so became the primary legal champion of the Episcopal Church in Virginia following the war, with, of course, America being severed from the Anglican Church. When the state legislature enacted the very radical Confiscation Act of 1802, which attempted to seize the historic lands of the church in the state, particularly the lands of established parishes, and then sell them for public revenue, Edmund Jennings launched a relentless, decades-long legal war against the state over this and carried the battle all the way to the highest level of the courts and single-handedly really protected Christ Church in Alexandria, while preserving the spiritual heritage of the Virginia gentry. And that was really his mark upon history. The death of the patriarch, Henry Lee II, in 1787 began, unfortunately, a long and painful period of material decline and displacement for the Leesylvania family. The estate first passed to his widow, Lucy, who lived out her final years trying to manage the fields until she passed in 1792. Bereft of the sort of personalities who had once commanded it, burdened it by bad investments made in this area, the magnificent house at Leesylvania met a fitting and tragic end in 1797 when an accidental fire swept through and burned it to the ground, and the family was unable to rebuild. It was Charles Lee who had effectively inherited the house and the state supporting it, as Henry II knew his son Harry's proclivities for speculation and largely cut him out of the will, and Charles was compelled to mortgage the remaining about 2,040 acres to his younger brothers. And eventually, the entire ancestral tract had to be sold away to strangers, ending 125 years of Lee ownership of the property. Light Horse Harry, meanwhile, squandered the Stratford fortune he married into, and so the various branches of the Leesylvania family had to leave the plantation life they had grown up in, and they largely moved to Alexandria as these body blows, delivered largely by financial imprudence, but also poor economy, struck. And so it's Alexandria that was the seat of this family, which went from being a planter family to largely a family of professionals, lawyers, and the like, and military officers, which is what it became most famous for. So, among the numerous children of the fifth generation who grew to maturity within this displaced urban environment, it was Sidney Smith Lee who was most beloved by his kinsmen. Born in Camden, New Jersey in 1802 during a temporary northern journey undertaken by his parents, Anne Hill Carter of Shirley Plantation and Light Horse Harry. This was Harry's second marriage. Throughout his youth and his adult career, Smith operated as an emotional anchor and favorite companion of his younger brother, Robert E. Lee. Within the family circle, the two brothers presented history with a fascinating study in contrast, particularly psychological contrast. Robert was characterized from early adolescence by a stately, reserved, and almost painfully correct decorum, one that's classical in just how stern and upright it is. Smith Lee, on the other hand, was the embodiment of the vivacity, warmth, and unruffled good cheer for which Virginia was known. Known universally by his affectionate family nickname, Rose, a tribute to his handsome features, bright blue eyes, and radiant complexion, Smith had a magnetic and outgoing personality that charmed everyone around him. He was known as the laughing cavalier of his generation, a man whose humor and easy social grace could dispel the anxieties that tended to cloud the mind of his brother Robert, who, of course, was always one who tried to care for their mother. Not that Smith didn't do that, but Robert was the more serious one. And so they had opposite temperaments, but the bond between them was absolute. It was fraternal devotion at its finest, and it remained untarnished across decades of military service and civil war. So his family had grown up with maritime interests because of the fish harvesting operation along the Potomac River, and Sidney Smith Lee followed that as he had to seek a living, leading him to the wooden decks of the United States Navy. He entered the service at the age of 15 and received his midshipman's commission in 1820, embarking upon a long and highly distinguished career, actually, that spanned about 40 years of global exploration and statecraft. He was an exceptionally proficient navigator and was a master of naval gunnery. He commanded warships across the oceans and became quite well respected by the Admiralty in Washington. This meant he had very interesting opportunities, such as leading forces during the naval operations of the Mexican War. In the spring of 1847, Smith was assigned to command the massive naval battery that was deployed during the siege of Veracruz. This post placed him in danger of serious enemy bombardment from the walls, and it was actually by a remarkable quirk of staging and coincidence of history that it was his brother Robert E. Lee, an engineer, who was deployed on the ground as the senior engineering officer directing the siege trenches and redoubts. So for days, Robert had to stand and watch from the parapets as his brother launched shells at the Mexican lines, and the Mexicans launched artillery shells right back at him, shells which exploded near Smith's naval battery, which was needed because of the heavy guns that they could bring on shore that the army hadn't carried with them. So through the smoke and terrifying din of the cannonade, Robert could see his brother Smith calmly pacing among the gun mounts, directing the crews with an unruffled smile on his face. A display of courage under fire that Robert proudly recounted in long, emotional letters sent back to their family in Virginia. Following the victory in Mexico, Smith's influence upon history really expanded even more. It was in 1853 that he was selected to command the steam flagship USS Mississippi during Commodore Matthew C. Perry's celebrated expedition to the Far East. And it was Smith who navigated the massive warship into the waters of Edo Bay, commanding the guns that backed Perry's high-stakes diplomatic ultimatum and successfully forced open the isolationist Tokugawa shogunate, making sure that the Empire of Japan would be opened to Western trade. It was Smith Lee that was leading the ship that made that happen, which is really quite one of those cool historical coincidences. So, upon his return to the United States, Smith Lee was recognized for his extraordinary administrative abilities in addition to his warfighting abilities by the Department of the Navy, and he was appointed to serve as the superintendent of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis, Maryland, much as his brother was at one point the superintendent of West Point. Another one of those crazy coincidences of history and really demonstrating the excellence of this family. After being superintendent for a bit, Smith assumed command of the Philadelphia Naval Yard, directing the infrastructure of the nation's then premier maritime capital. Yet it was at this moment of his career's apogee that the tragic events of April 1861 shattered Smith's world. When the Ordinance of Secession passed in Richmond, the naval captain had to face the same agonizing and soul-wrenching crisis of conscience that tormented his brother Robert. Smith had devoted his entire life to the flag of the United States. He loved the Navy. His rank was secure. He viewed the prospect of civil war with the same sort of profound and deep-seated regret that his brother did. But his conceptualization of duty was identical to Robert's. As he saw it, his allegiance belonged to his native state above anything else. And so on April 22nd, 1861, the heavy heart but clear conscience, Sidney Smith Lee formally resigned his federal commission, sacrificing his home, his salary, his career to enter the service of Virginia. He was appointed as a captain within the Confederate States Navy and spent the next 4 years primarily managing the defensive river batteries along the James and the infrastructure of the southern shipyards, what small infrastructure there was, and he provided valuable services to the Confederate States, those services, the grandeur of which paled in comparison to those of his son Fitzlee and his brother Robert, along with Robert's famous sons, Custis, Rooney, and Robert Edward Jr. So in future episodes, we'll cover some of these men and their sons in more depth. Primary saga destined to dominate our next chapter in this study of the Lee family is the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of Henry Light Horse Harry Lee. I'll show how this brilliant Princeton scholar, having secured military glory as Washington's favorite cavalry commander and a man who served as governor of Virginia, allowed his hyper-aggressive and romantic ambitions to turn inward against him and his own fortunes. And so we'll just chart his descent into a reckless and uncontrollable speculative mania, a compulsive obsession with Western land jobbing and schemes that destroyed his credit, alienated his kinsmen, and saw him twice incarcerated in a debtor's prison. And we'll trace the tragedy of his twilight years when he was maimed by a mob in Baltimore, forced to flee his family, leave Stratford, and eventually lead a broken, agonizing exile in the West Indies, leaving behind a family name deeply stained by moral and financial ruin. And then we'll cover his eldest son, Black Horse Harry Lee, born to Light Horse Harry's first wife, the divine Matilda, who lost Stratford and all that remained in a scandal that shook the family and the nation, and is quite interesting to cover. But it was out of the ashes of Light Horse Harry's ruin that the most famous figure of the entire Lee dynasty emerged. Robert E. Lee, born within the southeast bedchamber of Stratford Hall in January 1807, which he had to leave when just a wee lad because of his father's debts. Raised in a state of genteel poverty within brick townhouses of Alexandria, the youngest son of Harry's second marriage grew to maturity under the care of an increasingly invalid mother, abandoned by a ne'er-do-well husband, and Robert spent his life ensuring that he would never duplicate Light Horse Harry's irresponsibility. So we'll follow his life from his time at West Point to his marriage to Mary Anna Randolph Custis, the wealthy and spoiled great-granddaughter of Martha Washington, and his decades-long struggle to really restore his family's name, along with, of course, his wartime service and service after the war. And then after telling the tale of Robert E. Lee's life, we'll chart the fortunes of the sixth and really last important generation of the Lee family, Virginia, focusing on two of his sons, George Washington Custis Lee, known as Custis, and William Henry Fitzhugh Lee, known as Rooney. Custis was the eldest. He was a youth who replicated his father's stately silence, Reserve, who also graduated quite high up the ranks at West Point, first, actually, unlike his father, and served throughout the Civil War as a staff officer and military advisor to President Jefferson Davis of the Confederacy. We'll also cover his younger brother, Rooney, who was massive, boisterous, popular. He was a giant of a man in every sense of the term. He was legendary at Harvard as an oarsman and as a one-time friend of Henry Adams, who later turned on him. And Rooney became both an agriculturalist, who was actually quite adept at that, and also a famous cavalry commander. Rooney commanded under Jeb Stuart and rose to the rank of Major General of the cavalry, enduring a grueling captivity after being captured while wounded, and he was locked within the dungeon of Fort Monroe, his life threatened by execution orders, and he is a fascinating life. And then we'll track the other branch of the Leesylvania line descending through Light Horse Harry, and that would be General Fitzhugh Lee, the eldest son of Captain Sidney Smith Lee. So inheriting his father's radiant good looks, blue eyes, and irrepressible, jovial humor, Fitz was robust, fun-loving, a romantic, known as a cavalier. After a wild and just very wild career at West Point that I'm excited to cover, that saw him repeatedly nearly expelled for disciplinary issues, actually while his uncle Robert E. Lee was the superintendent of the place. Fitzhugh became one of the most daring, aggressive cavalry commanders in the Army of Northern Virginia, just saying a lot because he's compared against Wade Hampton, Jeb Stuart, and so we'll cover his career and some of his great deeds. But it didn't end with the war. He became a popular post-war governor of Virginia after having become a successful agriculturalist as well. He reconciled the state with the federal government. He attracted capital to the state that helped rebuild it, much as his uncle tried to help rebuild the state during Reconstruction. And in 1898, he became the only former Confederate general to take up his sword once more as a major general within the United States Army and lead regular American troops during the Spanish-American War in Cuba, a land in which he had served as an American consul, actually, after the war, too. So he's a fascinating figure. I'm excited to cover him. So the spirit of Leesylvania's turf and horsemanship lived on in his charges, transforming an old sectional conflict into a new national identity. Fitz was really the last of the Lees of public note, and so our story of the Lee family of Virginia will end with him, but I'm excited to get to that episode because it's a good one. So the long, many-generational saga of the Leesylvania dynasty approached its poignant transition on the midsummer days of 1869. It was on July 22nd, Captain Sidney Smith Lee died suddenly upon his small farm along the Potomac River after the war, his heart collapsing under the accumulated strains of a lifetime, particularly post-war displacement. Robert E. Lee himself, suffering from the advanced stages of the heart disease that would claim his life a year later, received this devastating news in his office at Lexington and rushed via train and carriage through the summer roads to arrive at the family churchyard in Northern Virginia, only to discover that the funeral service was already concluded and his beloved brother Rose was deposited beneath the soil. Robert stood before the grave, shaken, his stately self-control shattering as he wept. In a poignant letter sent to his grieving sister, Robert summarized the profound vacuum left by his brother's exit, writing that Smith's death had left a sad, permanent gap in our family that can never be filled in this world. It was the silence beginning to settle over the generation that had once commanded the storm. And it was really over for the Lee family there. They lasted for the remainder of the generation that had been born to Sidney Smith and Robert E. Lee, but their public fortunes ended after then, much because of what had happened a few decades prior. It was old Virginia kind of came to an end both before and during and certainly after the Civil War, as all the great physical capitals that had anchored the power and glory of the Lee family to the Virginia soil had faded away. Cobb's Hall, Dividing Creek, Lee Hall, Leesylvania, all of these houses were gone. Their walls collapsed, their timber frames rotted away, their broad tobacco fields overgrown by stands of wild pines that grew in the exhausted soil. A traveler visiting Freestone Point in later decades discovered nothing. There was just a silent, wild forest, no grand plantation seat. A passerby might discover a mound of foundation stones half concealed beneath briars and weeds at most. Stratford Hall, too, was as good as gone, sitting in the hands of others. But the turning point was in that there were two generations that followed that decline. Manly vigor, great courage, and general character characterized them. So for two generations after what could have been their line's downfall, with the sins of Light Horse Harry and his brothers losing everything, the sort of thing that ended many an English gentry family, this line of Lees held on to their familial honor and dynastic ambitions to the extent they could and produced some of the greatest men the line ever had. While the great brick chimneys eventually tumbled to the earth, the dynamic character, the brilliance, and the unmatched martial vigor and command of these younger sons remained permanently etched into the American story. And so they proved that though these estates could die, the estates of the Virginia gentry did die, a dynasty defined by duty can never be forgotten. And that's really what I think the Leesylvania Lees stand as a testament to. And so at that turning point in their history, the late 1860s, as old Virginia really faded away and died, they had one last gasp, that represented by Custis Lee, who became president of Washington and Lee University, and that represented by Fitz Lee, who helped rebuild Virginia after the war. And so, though the old Virginia that the Lees helped characterize and build was fading away, their memory remained, and what they had built remained. And I think they stand as an important testament to that. So thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed this overview episode, and I hope you're as excited as I am for future episodes on this branch of the family. I'm really excited to cover Fitz and Rooney and, of course, Robert E. Lee. But next time, we'll be beginning with Light Horse Harry Lee and his career as a cavalry commander. So thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you haven't already, as that's how you help this podcast grow and keep it going, which I, of course, very much appreciate. Bye.